3, 2.
Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Kinsella from the University of Limerick's Kemmy Business School. It's very nice to be with you today. We're going to talk to you today about some really useful concepts that can help you as part of your Leaving Certificate. And this is that the Department of Economics at the University of Limerick is going to run just for you. And so before we kick off, I'd like to thank Mairead from the BSTAI for helping us organise this event, and particularly to Elaine Milan and Erin King, without whom this would not be happening at all. So the next slide, please. We'll have two speakers today. First is myself telling you about gross domestic product, gross national income and all that. And then we'll talk with my colleague, Dr. Darragh Flannery, about interpreting and analysing data, giving an instructor's perspective. And then once we're finished, we're going to tell you a little bit about the Q&A, which we are really looking forward to. And so you'll have to do that by asking a question in the chat about the concepts, or anything else you like. And so we'll be taking questions throughout, and this session will be recorded as well for those teachers and students that haven't made it through, and my excellent colleague Mary Houston will be sending out those details later on. Okay, so with that, let's kick off. We're going to talk about measures of national income in the 21st century. So next slide, please. When I was your age studying economics, there was only one number that you needed to know, and that was gross domestic product. It's the value of all the final goods sold in the economy in a given year. And it's a really important number because it helps us analyze how wealthy we are and how much money we made. Now, it's a really important number for many reasons, but the biggest reason is a check on how we're doing. Not a perfect number by any means, doesn't measure the value of housework, it doesn't measure the value of caring, it definitely doesn't measure the environment. But what it does do is give us a rough barometer for how we're going. So you can see there in 2009, the economy generated 170 billion euros worth of output, which is pretty good. And then in 2010, it was 168, not so good, a little bit of a drop there, about a 2% drop, 171 billion, then up to 175, things getting better, 180, 195, very good. And then it jumps to 263. So for a jump from 195 to 263 is not good. That's not good at all. So next click, please. So the way economists would describe this is not good at all, to be honest. You can see there in growth rates where I compute the rate of change. So just take 1 year away from the other and divide by the base year and then multiply by 100. You can see 2%, 3%, 8%. Oh, that's a very good year for a developed economy like Ireland. And then 35%. When you net out some of the bigger factors, it's actually a 26% jump, which is absolutely extraordinary. And then it goes back to 3 and 11 and 9. So the reason that this matters massively, folks, is because if you're not measuring the economy correctly, then you're in serious danger of doing the wrong things. So with this measure, 35% increase. So that's the largest GDP increase anywhere in the world that year. It sort of tells you that there's something seriously wrong with the way you're measuring things. By this measure, if you believe this measure, the income per capita, GDP per person, just dividing the amount of money in the economy by the number of people, is 73,000 euros. The average person in Ireland doesn't get anywhere near that kind of number. It's closer to 40,000. So something's really wrong here. So we have to change it. How do we change it? Well, we change it in one particular way by constructing a new measure which subtracts some of the elements that have caused this massive price change. Next. So here's how we measure gross domestic product. We add private consumption, so the consumption of coffee that you buy and whatever you've had for breakfast this morning, that kind of stuff. And private investment, so building roads, building productive machinery and plants. Government spending, so spending on universities like the University of Limerick, or spending on hospitals, spending on healthcare, our healthcare workers' salaries during the pandemic. And then we add in exports, because exports bring money into the economy. We take away imports, and that gives us GDP. So your teachers have probably kind of drummed into you, y is equal to c plus I plus x minus g plus x minus m, right? And you've probably had that drilled into your brain at this point. So that's the kind of familiar issue. That's gross domestic product, that number. When you subtract away factor income from the rest of the world, so the amount of money that is being made by firms in Ireland, but the profits of which are remitted to other parts of the world, what's called net factor income, you get gross national product. So again, when I was in your shoes, what I learned was that gross national product was a better measure of the Irish economy, because gross national product took into account the influence of multinationals in the Irish economy. So these are companies like Apple and Dell and other companies like that are very large. They earn a lot of money around the world. They filter some of that money through Ireland, and that distorts the measurement of the size of the economy, because they're declaring money they earned here, money they earned somewhere else here. So it's a very, very important measure to get right. But even GNP, gross national product, is incorrect. So next slide, please. So what we need to do is to get very, very close to the correct measure of the economy by subtracting the things that we know have caused the explosion. So was it the EU taxes and subsidies that gives us gross national income? It wasn't. It turned out that wasn't the thing that made it rise so quickly. Next. In fact, it was these three things. So the income of redomicile companies. So these are companies that were brought, that were making sales in Germany and France and other places like that, and brought into Ireland. Then there's this thing called depreciation on research and development and intellectual property. So this is an accounting issue where companies who are able to move their money around, they're able to create a subsidiary in Ireland. They're able to charge sales and money, that revenue that they earned in another place, to the license holder, the intellectual property holder in Ireland, and they're then able to write off what they had earned in that other country as being from here. And then depreciation aircraft leasing. It turns out that Ireland is a massive contributor to the global aircraft leasing business. And it just turns out that when you want to lease an aircraft in China or Nigeria or India or anywhere, a lot of it comes through Ireland, just because we're a very, very open economy. And so these three factors, when you remove these three factors, you get something called modified gross national income. So why did they pick these three factors? Well, these were the ones that when they went into the weeds after 2015, after they saw this giant increase in gross domestic product, they went, these are the factors that are massively increasing over time. And so they constructed a new measure that removes this. But if you get away from the detail for a second, you focus on the larger picture, what's happened is the standard measure that's used by the United Nations for the rest of the world, GDP, is distorted for Ireland. So we need to take account of how open we are and how many multinationals we have in this country. And so it's dealing with a small open economy in a very, very globalized system. That's what gross national product, gross national income, and modified gross national income is for. So next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of scale here, consumption last year was 99 billion, investment was 109, government spending, net government spending, after we took out all the transfers, is 37 billion. The exports is 469, and imports is 360. So gross domestic product is 356 billion. Next. So you take away net factor income, you get 274 billion. Next. Take away taxes and subsidies, 275. Well, you add them rather. Next. And then G&I, you take away 4 billion for factor income. It's 49 billion in depreciation for R&D, and non-EU taxes 8 billion. So modified gross national income is 213 billion. So if you think about it, divide 356 by 4.8 million, you get about 73,000 euros. Divide 213 billion by 4.8 million, and you get about 43,000 euros per person. So one measure says we're really, really well off, and the other says we're about as well off as you might think we are. So it's a truer measure of a small open economy in the world. Next. So these are the main measures compared. You can see that modified gross national income is that yellow line there. So the way to read this is, on the horizontal axis you have the years, on the vertical axis you have billions of euros. Okay, and you can see the difference. They're tracking up together from 2009 to 2014, and then GDP and G&I just diverge because of the behavior of massive companies with respect to our national income. And it's a really important point. If you want to tax people, you have to know how well off they are. If you want to put subsidies into place, you have to know how well off you are. And so then you can see, you start with gross domestic product, then you get gross national product, then gross national income, and then modified gross national income. And we'll provide a bunch of resources for you to have a look at this after this session. Next slide. And so we have a bunch of different links here that you can go and learn more from these various experts, including Professor John Fitzgerald from the SRI and our colleagues at the Public Policy Institute. But for now, let me stop there, and next slide. Let me pass over to my colleague, Dr. Darragh Flannery, who will tell you about interpreting and analysing data in a structure's perspective. And then I'll come back and I'll tell you a little bit about where we're going next, and we'll also have time to answer your questions. So over to you, Darragh.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks very much. So as Stephen said, my name is Darragh Flannery. So I'm in the Department of Economics in the Business School in UL, colleague of Stephen's. So what I wanted to do today was to try to give you, it's something I do. I teach first year economics here in UL. So the big cohort, so like 300 students come to the normal times, come into the lecture theatre, and this is an aspect that I teach them when as part of that course. And funnily enough, it's something I teach to the postgrad as well. It's something I kind of hammer home to our master's students as well, is the idea of how to kind of interpret data when data is presented in table format, when it's presented in graphical formats, like Stephen had there, in terms of he was talking about GDP and G&I star and things like that. And there are other concepts, like trade concepts and like inflation and things like that, that are probably relevant to you in your studies, that might be relevant in terms of what you're going to be assessed on. So I kind of thought about it and thought, okay, I can give kind of from the instructor's perspective, because what I expect from my students when I'm asking them around tables of data and things like that, around trade or around inflation or around GDP and things like that. The first thing I want to do as well, I've just noticed in the published thing, is that all the schools in terms of the different places you are in the country, and that's great to see in terms of Tipperary and Drogheda and places like that. So I'd just like to point out my poster of the Limerick hurling team just there, so just especially the people from Tipperary in terms of the Ireland win, just you can just have a good look at that there before. Okay, yeah, you probably got a good look at it. So now we can get started. Okay, so so what I want to do is give from an instructor's perspective. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to give some kind of key points that from my point of view of what to do when you see a table of information around, and it can be anything in terms of, like I said, inflation or GDP or debt or trade kind of statistics, how to kind of approach it, and kind of the approach that I take personally, even when I'm looking at journal articles, things like that, and what I suggest to students, the approach that they take when faced with something like that. So if we go to the next slide, So I give some key steps in terms of what I think, again, what a kind of a decent approach, I think. So 4 key steps, I think, and then I'll give some examples. Okay, I've kind of put these into practice with a couple of examples, one with trade and one with inflation, if we have time. So first of all, whenever I would, sometimes when you see tables of information, even like what Stephen had there, with the GDP and the figures, the first reaction sometimes is kind of go, oh God, what's this? I have no idea. What's that stand for? What's this stand for? What's going on here? So the first thing I always tell students is just take a deep breath. Just take a deep breath and kind of just take your time and have a look in detail of the table and the graph. What's on the x-axis? So what's on the horizontal line? What's on the y-axis? What figures are they giving me? Are they giving me something related to overall economic activity? Is it GDP? Is it trade? What indicators? What labeling is on it? Is it talking about imports? Is it talking about exports? When it's talking about, if it's talking about inflation, is it talking about it on a 12-month kind of basis, on a 3-month basis, on a monthly basis? Because all these statistics can be presented in completely different ways. So the first thing that I look out for when I look at these statistics, if I look at a table from the CSO or derived from the CSO or anything like that, is I just look at the key kind of indicator, the labeling, the title, what's on the x-axis, what's on the y-axis, just to give me an idea, okay, what's going on here? What's going on with this bit of information? Okay, before I get into any detail in terms of, trying to understand specifically what's going on in the table of information or the graph or whatever it is, I just, in my mind, just want to get a kind of decent picture, an overall kind of picture of what's going on. So that's the first thing, and relax and look at it, because the initial reaction can be kind of a stress reaction, and kind of go, oh God, what's going on here? I have no idea. And then, you can get yourself into a bit of a muddle that kind of way and go down a path which, you don't want to. So that's the first thing that I always tell first year students, I tell postgrad students, and I tell myself, when I'm looking at different statistics, like I said, I look at statistics in the Higher Education Authority, for instance, I'm trying to pick out what's going on there. Take a deep breath and just try and look at the big picture first, what they're actually presenting to you. Secondly, then, what I would describe is try to describe what you see in your head. I know you'll be asked certain questions, you might be asked certain questions or comment about what you see, but what I want to kind of get across to you, I suppose, which I think is kind of helpful, is the difference between describing what you see and interpreting what you see. So the first thing you try to do is describe what you see. So if you look at a graph, if it's around trade, or if I relate to Stephen's one, because you had it a few minutes ago there in terms of the GDP, Stephen described what was happening in terms of GDP. It was going along grand, and then not grand. It was going, it kind of rocketed in 2015, so that's just describing what you see. So, okay, things are going along nicely, and then something weird happens, okay? So, and that's a kind of skill to look at when you're looking at tables and graphs. It's just, can you spot key trends? Can you spot relationships? So for instance, if it's a demand curve, if you're presented with a demand curve, and you're going to go, okay, what's on the x-axis, what's on the y-axis? So it's usually obviously price and quantity, and the demand curve is downward sloping. What does that tell us? It tells us something about the relationship between what's on the x-axis and what's on the y-axis, for instance. Okay, just to give you another example. So it tells us something about the relationship about what we're presented with here. In terms of Stephen's kind of data that he showed there, it's telling us about the trend, some kind of trend. So again, think to yourself, is there a couple of things I can pick out here in terms of describing what's in front of me, what's interesting? So in terms of, is it the relationship between things? Is it the trend in things across time? And it's just eyeballing the information and trying to describe the key kind of ideas within it, okay? So that's the second kind of thing I always do in terms of the data, and kind of somewhat approach in that way. The third thing that I generally try to do is interpret the data as opposed to describing the data. So you can describe the data all you want in terms of this happened, then this happened, and we can see this happened, okay? The interpreting the data, that's the tricky part. That's the really tricky part, okay? And that's the thing, like the complete health warning obviously is, I won't be setting your exam, I won't be grading your exams or anything like that, but what I do from my perspective to my students, the way I can distinguish between a good answer and an average answer in particular is someone who describes the data versus someone who describes and interprets the data. What I mean by interpreting the data is, why did that happen? So I saw a certain trend. Why do I see that trend happening? And again, if I relate it back to what Stephen talked about, he tried to get across the message, look, you saw this weird thing happening in terms of GDP. And then why do we see that? So around the aircraft leasing, understanding and digging into it. understanding why you see what you see. That's what I mean by interpreting the information. And I think that's important for anything, in describing anything that you see in terms of data. So I've given an example here. Show a table of exports and imports. Could you comment on why you see what you see? So if exports are rocketing up in 1 year or 1 month, why? Okay, describe it. That you understand what's happening. This is what I would expect of my students. But also, why is that happening? Okay. Same with imports. I'll give an example in a minute to see what I mean by that. The other thing to think about, and this maybe is something to think about yourselves as students. When you're faced with a question, you always think, like I set questions. So I set assignments and I set questions for my first years and my postgrads, and I used to teach second years kind of international economics as well. I'm trying to test them on something. I'm trying to get them to give me a story or give me something around the data. So think to yourself, kind of flip it in a way and think, what concept do you think they're trying to test you on? So what story are they trying to get me to tell? Every table, every figure has a story behind it, so what story are they trying to get me to tell here? Okay. So, so if I set a question around exports and imports, if it's me as an instructor with my first years and I give them information on imports and exports, I'm probably trying to get them, okay, can they see the trend? Can they tell the story around the trend? Can they tell me, interpret in terms of what's going on here? Can they tell me the reasons for what is going on here? So for instance, the pandemic, the global drop in demand due to the pandemic, Brexit, all these kind of things. So they're the kind of concept I'm going to probably try and test my students on. If I give them information on debt and inflation and GDP growth or things like that, if I just give them a table or some kind of information on that, in my mind, for me, if I give that to my first years or any groups of my students, I would expect that, or try to test them or try to assess them on their knowledge of the concepts of inflation and debt and the relationship, for instance, between debt, inflation and growth and all those kind of different kind of dynamics. So okay, you can try to put yourself in the mind of, why are they asking me this? What concepts, what relationship, what theories, what different things are they trying to test me on when they kind of put this question to me or this table of information to me? Because sometimes in a lot of exams, in third level in different places, there might be just a generic thing like describe what you see. So you have to put yourself in the mindset, okay, what are they looking for here? What are they actually looking for here? And so that's why I put it there in terms of trying to give you some steer in terms of a way of thinking, I suppose, when you see tables or figures of information, that is a useful approach for me. And as I said, this is what I suggest to students as well, and I think they find helpful sometimes. So if we go to the next slide, just to put some of that into practice, I suppose. So some examples here. So I've just taken this data right from the CSO. So again, you take a deep breath, you kind of, a lot of information going on here, like kind of think, okay, what the hell am I showing you here? So you can break it down. Okay, so trade example, what's the title? Imports. So we're talking about imports, obviously related to trade here. Okay, so talking about, goods flowing into Ireland, and we can see here, if we look down the bottom, it's imports 2020, January 2020, January 2021. So we're looking across time. So we're looking, one would imagine here, to some trends, some kind of trend across the year that a particularly noteworthy year, I suppose, in terms of 2020, and we're looking at it in terms of trade. Okay, so what if you were asked, for instance, to describe what's going on here, describe what you see here, right? So the first thing, just if it was me, for instance, okay, the first thing I would draw my attention to is kind of go, oh, geez, look at the total, big drop in imports here, big drop in imports. It's like, something going on there. So that's just describing what I see, okay? If I asked you to interpret that, the overall drop in kind of imports, why do you see that happening? Why do we see that happening? Well, one would imagine there was a couple of things going on. You have the recession, in terms of, the pandemic, obviously, in terms of, there's a massive economic shock. So Irish people, either their incomes are falling potentially. Okay, we don't have income information here, so maybe people's incomes are falling, so they're consuming less goods. They're not buying as many things from China and clothes and all the kind of things that we normally buy. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it's trade restrictions. Maybe things are happening in the background. Maybe it's nothing to do with incomes. Maybe people's incomes are fine. Maybe people are feeling uncertain about things, so they're kind of not consuming as much. So, it might be related very much to consumption kind of things. So people aren't importing as much. Maybe it's to do with other kind of conditions that, there are other factors going on. Maybe incomes are fine, but there's something else going on. Maybe there's other types of barriers to trade that have been put in place. So, there's a couple of possibilities here that we can talk about. All I can talk about is the possibilities given what I see here in front of me, the potential outcomes here, or explanations, should I say. If I break it down then, so I kind of get the overall picture. If I break it down then, I have Eurozone here. So this is imports from Eurozone countries, imports from total non-EU. So I'm reading left to right here. So that's kind of America, China, countries outside the EU, excluding the UK. So we can think Brazil, Australia, all these kind of countries, okay? And then we have Great Britain, imports from Great Britain. So this is, remember, comparing, think about what you're looking at here again. Imports from Britain in January 2020 versus imports from Britain in January 2021, okay? And the same for Eurozone, the same for other countries. If we look at the Eurozone first, yeah, there's a drop, okay? So there's a drop. Again, I'm trying to think, okay, what can I describe it? Can I interpret it? So the description of it, okay, yeah, there's been a drop in imports from Eurozone countries. We're buying less from Eurozone countries. And again, the same reasons might apply, drop in consumption, or maybe, you know, there might be a lot of factors going on there. Not so much from non-EU countries, so China and America, and if you dig into that a bit further, we actually are still importing about the same from the US and from China, and particularly across this time period. So, you know, whatever's going on isn't affecting our imports from those kind of countries, okay? Then you look at Britain and you go, oh, there, what the hell is going on there? Look at the drop, like in terms of as a proportional drop, if you work that out in terms of percentages, that's an insane drop for our geographically closest trading partner. So again, I can describe what's going on. How do I interpret it? So what happened? What happened in January 2021 that made that happen? Okay, okay. There's no state secrets here, you know, that in terms of trucks been backed up, you know, Amazon deliveries being delayed, Brexit, okay, so, and all that went with it, and protocol and all those kind of things, okay. So, you know, obviously we can describe what happened, and then we can interpret. Interpret is actually explaining what's happening there. And if you look at it, the big drop from the UK, like, you know, that massive drop in the UK, it explains a large proportion of the overall drop as well. So a large explanation of the overall drop in imports we see is actually because of Brexit. So we can actually interpret that as well. And that's the story. If I was looking for a story from this, part of the story is that, you know, that, okay, you have the pandemic, but in terms of drop in imports, it's a large part of it is Brexit as well, you know. So, and that data tells us that data tells us that story. The other thing, think about, last thing I'll just say on this slide in terms of imports is you could link it as well in terms of, if people, I know, because it's a big thing around it, people saving more, you know. So if people aren't importing as much, people aren't buying as much stuff from Germany and, you know, other kind of places. It could be the case as well, you know, the story behind the thing here is that what are people doing if incomes are the same, but people aren't buying as much stuff from abroad? Maybe they're buying more stuff from domestic producers, maybe they're saving it. And, you know, we see an increase in savings. So people might be, you know, moving away from consumption in terms of buying stuff from abroad, more towards saving. So that's just another kind of, you know, story within the story here in terms of what we see. So, you know, that said, I always say to students, look, you have a table there. You can tell loads of stories. I could go on for another 10 minutes talking about this table, you know, so there's loads of stories that you can tell and interpret in a different way. If you go to the next slide then, Aaron, please. Again, exports, look, the thing, I won't dwell on this too long, but the similar story, you can look at the total, you can see a drop in exports, right? You know, you can see, and you kind of think, oh, that maybe that's not good, you know, because as Stephen talked about, exports form a part of GDP, you know, or measures of national income. And you kind of think, where's that coming from? You look at the interesting thing I kind of thought was the Great Britain. Look at our exports to Great Britain. They haven't moved very much in the same time period. So the same time period, we're just talking about us selling goods to the UK, or to Great Britain, should I say now. So exports haven't moved very much. We just stopped buying goods from Great Britain in the same kind of quantity. So again, it's just an interesting kind of story in terms of that happening. You can see in terms of non-EU, you can see Eurozone, we're selling less to the Eurozone. You know, that's just, again, kind of the pandemic is probably hitting the Eurozone, the European countries very hard. And a lot of uncertainty in Europe, so they're not buying as much stuff, so they're not buying as much Irish stuff. So again, it's telling a story and telling a narrative around it. We can describe it, but then the important part is interpreting. Go to the next slide then as well. I'll just give an example here as well, slightly different one. This is about inflation. Again, you know, when I see these tables, I go, what the hell is going on here, you know? You know, what is this telling me? And then I try to take a deep breath and I go, okay, consumer price index. Okay, it has to be inflation, consumer prices, inflation, right? Fine. I'm up and going here, you know. And I can go, okay, 1 month, 3 months, 12 months. So it's just representing the price changes across different time periods. So if we look at March 2020, and if I draw your attention to kind of 0.8 there, it's just telling me that's the change in prices on a monthly basis, 1 month to the next. You know, so it's just presenting the inflation data in a certain way. If I go March 2020 and the 3 months column, it's just presenting the inflation from March 2020 back 3 months, what happened in terms of prices. So it's just presenting the inflation, the changes in prices in a different way. And then you have the 12-month to get a broader kind of picture. So it's presenting the data in different ways to kind of get a broader, more dynamic, longer term kind of picture. And you can see there it's zero. So prices basically did not change from March 2020 to March 2021. And it's just presenting it in a different way. You can tell certain things. So if I look at January 2020, the 12-month March 2020, the 12-month February 2020, it's minus bits of information. I can kind of get an idea in the trend that inflation must be kind of creeping upwards, because the 12-month thing is going upwards. So something must be happening, you know, in those intervening months, the months that I'm bringing in terms of 12 months. So something must be happening in terms of price levels. So, you know, again, you can kind of tell the story. Why do we get inflation? You know, maybe there's greater economic activity, should I say? You know, with greater economic activity, you generally get higher levels of inflation. So, you know, so again, it's telling me something that, you know, when you have deflation, obviously economic activity is going down. I would imagine that's telling the story of the pandemic, people demanding less, people saving more, you know, a lot of uncertainty around. So again, it's telling a story. Even inflation figures like that can tell you a story about what's going on in terms of economic activity in the background in an economy. So these are all indicators. Like you look at the European Commission, you know, when they're looking at the health of different economies around in Europe, you know, they look at different indicators. They don't just take one indicator. They take things like GNI start. They take things like GDP. They take things like exports, imports, balance of payments. They take things like inflation rates, you know, and they all kind of tell a story that hopefully, you know, that if you have a decent understanding of kind of economic concepts, general economic concepts in the first place, like inflation and those kind of things, that you're able to tell that story by looking at tables of information like this. So yeah, I hope so. I'm just on time, I think, in terms of that. So so thanks a million. Oh yeah, some links here. So this is really, so I put up a couple of links. I'll just explain just very quickly. So one is the first one is about, I just thought it was a good article I found about, I think it's a big thing that people are talking about. I get asked about it by my friends, you know, oh, we're building up all this money, we're spending loads of money, governments are, how are they going to pay it off? And one way is kind of this idea of inflating away debt. And I know that's a kind of interesting concept at the moment. And there's just an article, I think it's a very accessible kind of article that might be useful to you. The second one is just how to interpret graphs. That's some people over in Harvard. They say a lot of the same things that I say, so that's reassuring in a way, I suppose, but I just found it as well. CSO, that's just the consumer price index stuff. They've good information there about what's driving. So when prices are going up, prices are going down in a monthly, yearly kind of basis. They give little snippets in terms of what's driving it. So is it like fuel costs? Is it new taxes, whatever it is, you know? And then the last one there, I think is very interesting, well, very accessible. That's the governor of the central bank. He does a blog, and you know, he kind of brings up and he tries to make complex stuff quite accessible as well, which I think is very useful. And he's a couple of things in there of why economics is interesting. So, you know, that's great, because you know, that's what I think as well. He's a couple of kind of articles in there around more kind of technical kind of stuff to make it more accessible, and then kind of generic stuff, so which I think is worth a read there. So that link as well. So yeah, sorry for kind of about a minute over time there. So I'll go back to Stephen now for kind of the Q&A. So thanks a lot.
Brilliant, Darragh, that was excellent, very clear, very succinct. As a dub, I have to say, up the dubs, of course. But yeah, I know I'm never going to change. But there's a question to you actually right away from a questioner. I guess to you, Darragh. Can you tell us about the pandemic's effect on imports, please?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, of course. Yeah, so you can see, like we saw in terms of the information there, you know, you get a snapshot in terms of the total. You know, if you just focus on the total, you go, geez, there's a big drop in terms of imports, and that could be driven by, you know, people being, if it was me, you know, geez, I'm not sure what's going to be going on into the next couple of years, so I withhold in terms of some of my consumption. And part of that is in terms of I don't buy the laptop that's going to come from, you know, it's not been built in Ireland really, so it's going to come from abroad. So I'm reducing some of my consumption, and that has a knock-on effect then on imports into the country. The funny thing is there doesn't seem to be, if you that's why I put the data that I presented in that kind of way. There is a bit of an effect. Obviously, there's a big effect in terms of overall imports. But if you just look at the UK, the drop in imports in the UK is actually constitutes a big proportion of the drop across the last year, basically. Okay, and the reason for that is Brexit. It's not the big reason behind that is it's the administrative. It's actually the red tape and things like that. So the imports there, you can see the drop in the UK is about, it's constituting a large proportion of the overall drop. The other drop is coming from the Eurozone. Like our imports from China and America, they remain kind of stable. So again, I've kind of teased out what's going on here. So our imports have dropped big time from the UK. There has to be the red tape around Brexit, I would imagine, the complexity around that. And then the Eurozone, we've dropped our imports as well. And so you could probably attribute more of that to kind of changes in consumption and things like that in terms of, partly as well in terms of the Eurozone kind of imports as well, maybe around Brexit as well because of the land bridge through the UK as well. So again, it might be reflective of not so much kind of, it is an economic tie to it, but more administrative and politics essentially, you know what I mean, as opposed to the kind of macroeconomic environment. So so that's what so it could be a mix of that economic kind of side, but also just the administrative side kind of things as well. So I don't know if Stephen has any kind of additional things that he could add.
No, it's very, very clear, Darragh. I guess the main thing to understand from all of this is how interconnected everything is. So economics, if it teaches us anything, it teaches us that my spending is your income is my spending. This is how the economy is connected all together, which I think is a really important point. And so when Britain decided to make a change and leave the European Union, that caused a reduction in imports and exports, in fact, in Ireland. And in the leaving certificate, you will absolutely be asked to interpret data precisely like this. And so it's a very, very useful skill for you to learn. There's another question. What should we be reading to get a sense of what's going on in the world economy? This is an excellent question, presumably from a teacher, and not from one of the students. But I mean, who knows? A really, really good question. I like to read Martin Wolf in the Financial Times. Maybe Elaine can dig up a link to that. There will be very, very cheap subscriptions for you to the Financial Times, and I recommend anyone to read it. It's written in a very non-technical way, but what it does is it gives you a very, very good sense of the current issues in the global economy. So, for example, today there's a big thing on China's GDP. So we would have spent a lot of time looking at China's GDP there. So that's a really, really important point. So I think that's a very, very important point to do. So I think when you're filling out essay type questions, for example, essay type questions are typically always about kind of the macroeconomic elements of the paper. So the more up to date data that you can get, the better. And I think if the FT isn't free, it should be nearly free. So I can't recommend Martin Wolf's work enough, but generally the work of the Financial Times in talking about the big issues. If I was teaching a class, I would have a question about what are the big issues of the day. Is it inequality? Is it Bitcoin? Is it Brexit, COVID, because that those things are going to come up, and even if they don't, you're going to be able to refer to them in a fairly easy way. So I'm just conscious a little bit of time. We promised to finish at 9:50 for you guys. So do you think Ireland is becoming more unequal Thanks for your time today. We're very, very pleased to do this, and we're, we understand that students and teachers are under a lot of pressure at the moment. So anything we can do to help, we absolutely will, and we're going to run more sessions like this, as we said before. Darragh, do you think Ireland is becoming more unequal? Easy one for you there.
Yeah, well, the funny thing about the strange thing about Ireland is really, really unequal from a market income perspective. So when you don't include like benefits, so you don't include unemployment benefits, all those kind of things, we have a really wide gap between the haves and have-nots. When you adjust for that, I don't say not too bad, but the gap actually really comes down in that kind of sense. So in terms of more unequal, God, I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, to be perfectly honest, in terms of more unequal. I think there's a perception. I think there's definitely a perception of Ireland becoming more unequal. I don't, from what I remember in terms of the statistics and looking at it, I don't think there's a huge pile of evidence to support a very big gap over a widening gap, should I say, over the past 10 years in terms of, I don't think it's narrowed very much, to be honest, but it hasn't widened in any great shape in the last 10 years. However, I will say the next 5 years will be key in terms of that, because if you look at who the pandemic is affecting in terms of employment, things like that, it's not people in middle, higher incomes, it's people in lower incomes, and particularly women in kind of lower paid jobs. So to answer your question, from the top of my head, there's no great evidence, as far as I can remember, in terms of after you take into taxes and benefits and things like that, that inequality has widened very much over the last 5 to 10 years. However, the ... and that is wait and see over the next 5 years, because the pandemic, as I said, like you look at it's really eye-catching. Tax revenues, income tax revenues haven't really changed at all that much in the last year. And you kind of go, geez, there's loads of people not working. But they're not in the tax bracket. They're the lower income kind of group, so they're not in the tax bracket. Whether those people get their jobs back, that'll be the real key issue, because in terms of the jobs in restaurants and these kind of places, whether they come back, all of them come back, it'll be tricky. And it won't be the people in middle, higher incomes that'll be as affected, because they're getting in jobs that can work from home and things like that. So it might change. That story might change a good bit, unless there's policy interventions and things like that in the next while. So no, I don't think so in the last 5 to 10 years, but it'll be interesting. I want to watch definitely in the next while.
Great. I think that's a really important answer, Darragh, and a really important way of answering as well, which might provoke a bit of thought. We're very close to time, but we've 4 more questions. Okay. Assuming students won't be given a breakdown of marks awarded for each part of each question based on papers we've seen to date, very difficult to guess how many points they're looking for in an answer. What's the best strategy for the students? Fill the space provided, essay type answers, or follow similar state explain example type approaches from before? I mean, personally, full disclaimer here, I don't set the state exam in any way, but my approach to exams has always been to fill the space provided with the best available information. Show your learning, show how much you understand, show how relevant your answer is to the question, and I think you'll be fine. That's my personal approach there. Jack asks, and hello Jack, thank you for your question. Will COVID be on the exam, either directly or indirectly? Jack, I'm pretty sure it will be. How will Biden's proposal for a global minimum corporate tax rate affect Ireland? I actually just recorded a podcast about this. Elaine, if you can find it on the Currency website, we'll send you a link to that. The answer is it's complicated, but we'll get there. Darragh says, Tyler Cowan and Tim Harford, excellent people. Do you think Bitcoin will become money in the future? Oh, that's a huge one. Darragh, I'm going to throw that one to you. Will Bitcoin become money in the future? Nice easy one at the end.
The short end, oh God, I don't honestly have a clue. Bitcoin is so beyond my my wheelhouse as such. Do you know what there is though? Bitcoin, I just know the podcast thing I put up, and I'll listen to it myself actually. There is a podcast by John Danielson on that Vox, so I put up podcasts as well. There is a podcast called Timely Question, What if Bitcoin Succeeded? So what would the world look like if Bitcoin completely replaced fiat currency, so normal money? So complete cop-out, but I'm going to suggest to that person, listen to that podcast, and I will as well, just to tune myself up as well. So apologies, but
Yeah, but I think that's exactly right. When it comes to economics, the best thing about economics is the questions never change and the answers always change. So you can always keep learning. It's a fascinating subject to study and to spend your life studying, in fact. Final question. Thank you for the talk. You're very welcome. You were talking about the 2015 jump. My class went to see Paul Krugman speak when he was in Ireland last year in Kilkenny, I believe. Yeah, I was there too. I believe it was him who coined the term leprechaun economics. He did. Do you think this term has affected our image as a country and our ability to manage our economy effectively? No, I don't think so. I think Ireland has a very good reputation abroad, but Paul has an excellent gift of the gab. So yeah, I think that'll be good as well. Can you skip to the last slide, please? There's some information in the slides about the courses that we do here in UL, and you can look at that afterwards. But one of the things I want to finish on is to tell you about the next webinar that we will be running. So can we jump to the next slide, please, or the last one, which is all about we're on social media and all that. You can have a look at that later. Yeah. So Thursday the 15th, sorry, that's today, Thursday the 22nd of April, there'll be another one of these webinars with Professor Eoin Reeves and Dr. Rita Buckley, my colleagues here at the Kemmy Business School. They'll be talking about inequality. They'll be talking about concentration indexes. They'll be talking about lots and lots of the key issues that secondary school teachers asked us to address through Mairead and the BSTAI, and we will do precisely that. So the only thing that remains is to thank everyone who's watching, either live or recorded, for your time, to thank all your teachers for all the work that they're doing, both in front of you and behind the scenes. We know there's a lot going on that students might not see, so thank you to all the economics teachers for everything you're doing. We're very, very happy to help you in any way we can. In terms of organising this event, it wouldn't have happened without Elaine Milan, Erin King and Mary Houston, our colleagues here at the business school. And again, just a final thank you to Mairead from the BSTAI for making all of this possible. So I will finally just thank my colleague Darragh Flannery for being up for this. We're very proud and privileged to be able to do this kind of work. And so I will sign off and just thank you all very much for your time. Take care.